Hello everyone. In this lecture video, I'll walk you through some of the ways you might structure your deliberative research essay. What do we mean when we refer to structure? Well, one definition, and this isn't necessarily the only definition of structure, but this is a very useful definition. Uh, One definition of structure is that it is how something is divided into parts, and then how those parts are related to form a whole. And this idea of structure can be applied to how we structure maybe a physical building, um, how we structure a room. It can be applied to how we structure our government or our schools, our society, but it can also be applied to writing. And one of the things we can do with this definition is it can help us to figure out the process of how we might structure a particular piece of writing. And through this definition, we can ask how we might divide a piece of writing into parts, mainly paragraphs, and also how we might find meaningful relationships among those paragraphs, articulated in strong, meaningful transition sentences, and also aided as much as possible by a good order. One very common way to structure a piece of writing is academic argument structure. It's also known as classical argument structure. This is the structure that most of us have been taught to use. It's very commonly used in academic settings, such as in writing assignments, academic papers, for instance. But it's also used in op-ed articles in newspapers, and also in political speeches. And I think that the parts of this structure will be very familiar to you. We start with an introduction. And in that introduction, we reach out to our audience. We reach out to their everyday lives and guide them slowly, logically, meaningfully towards our thesis. And our thesis statement is simply the main claim we're going to argue in this piece of writing. And then sometimes, this is an optional section in my mind in academic argument structure. Sometimes we'll move into background, where we provide some background on the issue that we're going to be taking a stance on. Sometimes that background information is a part of the introduction. Sometimes it's just skipped over, but it can be a very useful section. Once we get through that section, if we have it, then we move into our body paragraphs. These are also often called the lines of argument. And in our body paragraphs, we simply start trying to support our thesis, to prove our position on the argument, on the issue, excuse me. We start off in the body paragraphs often articulating a claim that supports the thesis, and then we provide some evidence that supports and develops that first claim. Then obviously we move into a second claim that also supports, but in a different way it develops the thesis. And then we once again provide evidence that supports and develops this second claim. And we can keep going with this, as long as we like. We can have simply like a little 3 or 4 or 5 paragraph essay, or we can use this structure to write an entire book. We can keep going, presenting more and more evidence to support our argument, our thesis statement. And then eventually, this isn't in every single academic argument, but eventually we'll get to our counterargument section if we want to include it. And in that counterargument section, we will present the arguments that we disagree with. We'll present the other side's positions on the issue, and then we will show how that other side's positions is wrong, why your audience should not agree with those positions. And then finally, we'll get into our conclusion. And in that conclusion, we reach out to our audience once again. But in this case, we want to explain to them what they should do, think, or feel now that they've read our arguments. We want to give them something to take with them in their everyday lives, a kind of bridge to help them get back to their everyday lives, changed forever because of the strength of our argument. But this is not the only way to structure a piece of writing. In fact, this structure has serious limitations. So one way I like to paraphrase this structure to point out those limitations is as follows. It's as if the writer is saying, hey, you, audience, I'm right. This is why I'm right. This is also why I'm right. By the way, did I mention that I'm right? And, there's some other people out there, the people on the other side of the issue. You might even be some of these people. You're wrong. You're dead wrong. This is why you're wrong. And then conclusion, mic drop, walk away from the stage. This paraphrase of academic argument structure, I think, helps us to see exactly how this structure is limited. First, it's limited because it presumes and creates conflict with the other side of an issue. It creates conflict often with your audience, or at least part of your audience. And then second, it keeps you, the writer, from thinking critically, from questioning your own position, and from considering the strengths and weaknesses of multiple arguments related to an issue. It keeps us from engaging with our audience in a kind of deliberative, critical thinking fashion. Of course, this is what I'm asking you to do in your deliberative research essay. So we can see this particularly if we look at this element of the prompt. You're going to articulate an issue as a focused question, and then compose an essay that clearly organizes, presents, and evaluates the different arguments you found or maybe developed on your own for your chosen local community audience. This prompt, in fact, points us in a different direction, away from strictly following the academic argument structure. Now, some of the elements of the academic argument structure are fine. We'll keep some of them, I think. We'll have an introduction, although instead of leading to a thesis statement, it'll lead to a question. We might provide some background information. Of course, that's still optional, although I think it's a good thing to do. And then finally, we'll have a conclusion. We'll, tell our reader what we want them to do, think, or feel now that they've read our paper. The question becomes what to do with those body paragraphs. And the clue for that is in the prompt. In the body paragraphs, what we'll do is present and evaluate arguments. The next question to consider is how do we create paragraphs? How do we divide the body of our paper up into paragraphs? And there are a few different ways we can do that. Our first option is to have our first body paragraph presenting the first one argument, and then the next body paragraph evaluating that argument. Then we move into the second argument. We present the other argument or another argument related to our issue, and then we evaluate that second argument. And then if we have more arguments, we can continue on and on. The second option is to present and evaluate the first argument all in one paragraph. And then when we move into the second argument, we might do something similar. We might present and evaluate the second argument. And then we can continue on in that vein. In our third option, we might begin our body paragraphs by presenting the first argument in one paragraph, and then presenting the other side to the argument in the second paragraph. And then maybe in our third and our fourth paragraph, we might evaluate, the first argument and the second argument, et cetera, until we're done evaluating and we've reached our conclusion. Now, I've seen plenty of papers that don't stick to these three options strictly. They mix up argument summaries and evaluations more organically by feel, and honestly, that's fine too. The important thing is that you present multiple arguments and evaluate them in a structure that makes sense. The next thing to consider is order. Most of you will find one side of an issue's arguments to be stronger and another side's to be weaker. If that's the case, there are probably two clear options. In option one, you can present the first argument, explain why it's the better argument, present the second argument, explain through your evaluation why it's the worse argument, and then you can conclude clearly siding with the better argument. The second option is the reverse. You present the first argument, explain why it's the worse argument, present the second argument, evaluate it, explaining why it's the better argument, and then you can continue on from there if you have more than two arguments that you're going to be evaluating. And then you conclude, finally, siding with the better argument. And this option I like because it has the benefit of allowing you to transition right from your explanation of why the second argument is better into your conclusion. It just tends to create a nice little transition. Now, what if you're in a situation where you're evaluating an issue, but you don't have a dog in the fight, as it were? There's not one side that you find to be more clearly right. Here's an option for you. So in this option, you'll present the first argument, explain its strengths and weaknesses, present the second argument, explain its strengths and weaknesses. And then you can conclude in a number of ways. You might conclude that both sides have merit, but one side is slightly stronger. You might conclude that more research needs to be done on the issue before you can decide. You might conclude that all positions on the issue are ridiculous, or that the issue is a purely fictional distraction from other more important issues. Ultimately, you have a lot of options for structuring this paper well. Hopefully the options I've presented give you a better idea of how this paper can work. Of course, if you have questions, shoot me a message or set up a conference. Otherwise, happy structuring.